The strangest thing about fear is that it spreads faster than the truth. Ethan Carter had heard those words from an old cargo captain years ago, but he never expected to remember them while standing beneath the cold glow of the Carthos City Exchange. Rain drifted through the maze of steel walkways in a fine silver mist, hissing softly against neon signs and polished landing pads. Freight shuttles descended overhead with a deep mechanical hum that vibrated through the metal streets, while thousands of commuters hurried beneath glowing advertisements without looking at one another. The city never truly slept. It simply changed shifts. Ethan adjusted the worn collar of his brown work jacket and glanced at the parts list glowing across his handheld tablet. His transport ship needed a replacement plasma regulator before sunrise, or another contract would disappear into someone else's hands. He had exactly 600 credits left after paying docking fees, fuel taxes, and overdue maintenance. Buying anything unnecessary was not an option. He turned toward the industrial market, expecting another ordinary afternoon among merchants arguing over prices and mechanics bargaining over broken engines. Instead, he noticed something impossible. An entire section of the crowded marketplace stood unusually quiet. Not empty, quiet. Hundreds of people continued walking, but every conversation seemed to lower into nervous whispers whenever they passed a circular platform surrounded by black security posts. Nobody stepped inside the painted boundary. Nobody even looked directly at the figure sitting there. Curiosity slowed Ethan's pace. The platform resembled an auction stage, although no auctioneer spoke. No buyers gathered. Only a single young alien woman sat on a simple metal chair with lightweight restraint cuffs resting loosely around her wrists. She did not struggle. She did not cry. She simply watched the rain collect at the edge of the platform before dripping onto the pavement below. Her skin carried the deep sapphire blue common to only a handful of distant civilizations. Long silver-white hair rested across her shoulders, slightly damp from the moisture drifting through the open roof. Her face showed no anger, only exhaustion. Beside her stood a weathered sign painted in bold black letters. Cursed. Final sale. No returns. Ethan frowned. It looked less like a warning and more like a sentence. A pair of teenagers hurried past behind him. One glanced toward the platform before immediately looking away. Don't stare, his friend whispered. My uncle said everyone who touched her disappeared. An elderly vendor overheard them and quietly crossed 2 fingers against his chest before returning to arranging mechanical parts that suddenly seemed far more interesting than the woman only 20 feet away. Ethan studied the crowd instead of the girl. Fear had settled over them like invisible fog. Nobody questioned the sign. Nobody asked who had written it. Nobody seemed interested in whether it was true. They simply accepted it because everyone else already had. The alien woman slowly lifted her eyes. For a brief second, they met Ethan's. Bright silver. Calm. There was no plea for help hidden inside them. No expectation. She looked at him the same way someone looked toward another passing shuttle crossing the night sky. Temporary. Distant. Already leaving. Ethan felt strangely uncomfortable. Not because of her. Because she had already learned what people usually did next. Walk away. A loud electronic chime echoed across the market. A merchant climbed onto a nearby crate and called toward the gathering crowd. Last chance. 600 credits. Take the cursed girl, and every legal responsibility transfers immediately. No refunds. No complaints. No compensation if misfortune follows. Nervous laughter rippled through the audience before fading almost instantly. Nobody stepped forward. Nobody even pretended to consider it. Ethan looked back down at the glowing parts list in his hand. 600 credits. Exactly what remained in his account. Enough to repair his ship. Enough to keep working another month. Enough to survive. His thumb hovered over the screen as rain continued tapping softly against steel rooftops overhead. Then, almost without realizing it, he closed the tablet, slipped it into his jacket pocket, and took one slow step toward the platform while the whispers around him suddenly stopped. Ethan stopped at the edge of the painted circle while every pair of eyes in the marketplace seemed to settle on him. The silence felt heavier than the rain. Somewhere overhead, a cargo shuttle released a burst of compressed steam that rolled across the rooftops like distant thunder, yet nobody inside the market spoke above a whisper. The merchant climbed down from his crate with an expression that balanced amusement and disbelief. He was a broad-shouldered alien with weathered gray skin and a business smile that never quite reached his eyes. "You are not actually considering this," he said, studying Ethan's faded jacket and worn work boots. Ethan glanced toward the young woman again. She had not moved. She sat with perfect posture despite the restraints resting around her wrists, as though dignity was the only possession nobody had managed to take from her. "How much?" Ethan asked quietly. The merchant laughed once. "You heard me. 600 credits. Less than the value of the chair she is sitting on." A few people nearby exchanged nervous glances. One woman pulled her small son closer and hurried away before Ethan could answer. Another man muttered something about foolish humans and bad decisions. Ethan ignored them. "Why is she here?" he asked. The merchant shrugged. "People say she brings silence wherever she goes." "People say many things." "That is true." The merchant folded his arms. "They also say 3 owners vanished. One business collapsed overnight. One family abandoned their home without explanation. Nobody wants to test the stories anymore." Ethan looked directly at the alien woman. "Do you have a name?" For the first time, she answered. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, carrying none of the bitterness he expected. "Lysera." Ethan nodded once. "I am Ethan." She lowered her eyes again. "You should leave, Ethan. Because I might lose 600 credits? Because I might cost you far more than money." The words lingered between them while the marketplace watched in complete stillness. Ethan noticed something strange. Every warning he had heard came from someone else. Nobody had mentioned anything Lysera herself had actually done. There were only stories, rumors, frightened expressions, and a sign someone had painted. Nothing more. He slipped his hand into his jacket and removed his credit chip. The merchant's smile immediately widened. "You really are serious." "Transfer the ownership documents," Ethan replied, "and remove the restraints." The merchant accepted the payment before Ethan could change his mind. The transaction completed with a soft electronic tone that echoed across the silent square. 600 credits disappeared from Ethan's account. Every spare dollar he owned was gone. A security officer stepped forward, unlocked the restraint cuffs, and quietly backed away without looking Lysera in the eyes. Nobody applauded. Nobody protested. The crowd simply stared as though witnessing someone step onto a bridge they believed could not possibly hold. Lysera slowly rubbed one wrist where the metal had rested. She remained seated for another moment before standing with graceful caution. She was taller than Ethan had expected by nearly 6 inches, though exhaustion softened every movement. Rain shimmered across strands of silver hair as she faced him. "Why?" she asked. "You do not know me." Ethan picked up the small travel bag that had been left beside the chair. It contained almost nothing. A folded blanket, 2 books with worn covers, a dented metal cup. Everything she owned fit inside a single weathered bag. He handed it to her without opening it. "Because nobody deserves to be treated like a warning sign," he answered. Lysera stared at him in silence, and for the first time since he had entered the market, uncertainty crossed her composed expression. Around them, the whispers slowly returned, quieter than before, carried away beneath the endless sound of rain tapping against steel roofs as Ethan turned toward the exit, fully expecting Lysera to remain behind. Instead, after only a heartbeat of hesitation, he heard soft footsteps following him through the empty path the crowd had silently opened. The rain had eased into a thin mist by the time Ethan and Lysera reached the elevated transit bridge overlooking the Western Freight District. Below them, hundreds of transport vehicles glided through illuminated traffic lanes, their navigation lights reflecting across wet steel like streams of liquid color. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. Their footsteps echoed softly through the nearly empty corridor while advertisements flickered across enormous holographic panels suspended above the city. Ethan finally broke the silence. "Do you have somewhere you would rather go?" Lysera answered without looking at him. "If I did, I would have gone there long before today." He accepted the answer with a quiet nod. There was no self-pity in her voice, only simple fact. They continued walking until they reached the docking district where Ethan's aging transport vessel rested inside a weathered maintenance bay. The ship looked exactly like its owner, reliable, functional, and carrying the visible scars of years spent working far beyond luxury trade routes. Paint had faded from the hull in several places. Fresh welding marks surrounded one engine housing. A portable ladder leaned against the open maintenance hatch. Lysra stopped several feet away. She did not move any closer. Ethan noticed immediately. Something wrong. She studied the ship with an expression he could not quite understand. This is your home. Most days. Then I cannot enter. Ethan frowned. Why not? She lowered her eyes toward the rain collecting beneath her boots. Because homes do not stay safe after I cross their doors. Ethan waited, expecting more explanation, but none came. Instead, she stepped backward as though increasing the distance might somehow protect him. You should leave me here, she said quietly. You have already shown me more kindness than anyone else has in years. That is enough. Ethan rested one hand against the ship's open hatch. You keep warning me. Because nobody warned the others. What happened to them? For the first time, uncertainty crossed Lysra's face. She searched for words that never seemed to arrive. Things became quiet. Ethan almost smiled despite himself. That is not much of an explanation. It is the only honest one I can give. A maintenance drone floated overhead carrying replacement engine parts before disappearing into another docking bay. Somewhere farther down the platform, someone laughed at an old joke, followed by the metallic clang of repair tools striking steel. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life. Ethan looked around the busy station before turning back toward Lysra. Listen carefully, he said. I have repaired reactors that exploded without warning. I have landed on moons where every weather report was wrong. I once spent 3 days trapped inside a cargo elevator because somebody wired the emergency controls backward. Strange things happen all the time. I do not blame people for them. Lysra's silver eyes lifted toward him. You should. Not without evidence. The answer seemed to unsettle her more than fear would have. She had expected rejection, perhaps even anger. Calm certainty appeared to confuse her. Ethan climbed halfway up the ladder before glancing back. I was planning to make soup. Nothing impressive. Just vegetables, bread, and whatever is still edible inside the galley refrigerator. You are welcome to join me. She remained perfectly still. You trust me inside your ship? I trust the person standing in front of me. Another long silence followed. Finally, Lysra whispered, almost too softly to hear. You are making a mistake that cannot be undone. Ethan opened the hatch and warm yellow light spilled across the damp platform. The welcoming glow stood in sharp contrast to the cold blue lights of the station outside. He simply held the door open without another word. Lysra stared at the light for several long seconds. Her breathing slowed. One cautious step carried her closer. Then another. She stopped directly beneath the doorway, her hand trembling slightly, as though crossing the threshold required more courage than surviving years alone. Behind them, somewhere beyond the endless rows of docking bays, a deep mechanical tone rolled across the city. It was not loud. It lasted only a few seconds. Even so, every worker on the platform instinctively paused and looked toward the distant skyline before returning to their jobs. Ethan barely noticed it. Lysra did. The color quietly drained from her face as she whispered to herself. It has already begun. Lysra remained frozen beneath the open hatch, while the warm light from inside the transport spilled across the wet landing platform. Her silver eyes stayed fixed on the distant skyline, where the strange mechanical tone had faded into silence. Ethan followed her gaze, but saw nothing unusual beyond rows of blinking navigation beacons and cargo cranes stretching toward the clouds. Was that some kind of station alarm? He asked. Lysra answered almost absent-mindedly. No, it was listening. Ethan looked back at her. Listening to what? She hesitated before quietly shaking her head. I hope I am wrong. He had spent too many years solving practical problems to chase invisible fears. Engines failed because parts wore out. Power grids collapsed because somebody ignored maintenance schedules. Every mystery eventually had an explanation. Come inside, he said gently. Standing in the rain will not improve either of our evenings. After another long moment, Lysra finally stepped across the threshold. She moved carefully, almost respectfully, as though entering a place she believed she had no right to occupy. The cabin smelled faintly of machine oil, fresh coffee, and warm metal. Shelves filled with repair manuals lined one wall beside neatly organized tool cases. A faded photograph of Ethan standing beside an older cargo ship rested above a compact dining table secured to the floor. Nothing inside looked expensive, but everything carried signs of care. Lysra slowly looked around the small living space. You repaired all of this yourself? Ethan smiled while hanging his jacket beside the door. Everything except the coffee maker. That one keeps winning. For the first time, the corner of Lysera's mouth lifted ever so slightly before disappearing again. Ethan walked into the narrow galley and opened the refrigerator. Good news. The vegetables survived another week. He placed carrots, potatoes, onions, and vegetable broth onto the counter before filling a small cooking pot with water. Soon the gentle sound of simmering replaced the quiet tension inside the cabin. Steam carried the comforting scent of herbs through the room. Lysera remained standing until Ethan noticed. There is no rule saying guests have to stand. She looked uncertain. Guest. She repeated the word softly, as though tasting a language she had forgotten. Then she carefully sat in the chair closest to the window. Outside, rain continued sliding across the glass while maintenance crews moved between docking bays beneath rows of bright white work lights. Ethan sliced vegetables with practiced precision. When was the last time you had a home-cooked meal? He asked. Lysera searched her memory for several seconds before answering. I do not remember. The knife stopped for only a heartbeat before continuing. Ethan chose not to ask another question. Some silences deserved patience instead of curiosity. Minutes later, he placed a bowl of steaming soup beside her along with thick slices of fresh bread warmed inside the small oven. Lysera stared at the meal without touching it. Is something wrong? Ethan asked. She blinked rapidly. Nobody has ever served me first. Ethan looked genuinely puzzled. The cook always serves the guest first. She wrapped both hands around the warm bowl, letting the heat settle into her fingers before taking a careful sip. Her shoulders relaxed almost imperceptibly. Outside the ship, however, something else changed. The constant hum of docking traffic suddenly faltered. One by one, transport engines powering across the station grew strangely quiet. Digital billboards flickered once before turning completely dark. The overhead announcements that repeated every few minutes never came. Mechanics lowered their tools and glanced upward. Pilots stepped from their cockpits wearing confused expressions. Even the maintenance drones hovering outside Ethan's window stopped moving at exactly the same moment. Ethan slowly looked toward the silent docking bay. That is unusual. Lysera gently lowered her spoon. Her face reflected no surprise, only sadness. Without taking her eyes from the darkened station outside, she whispered, "This is always how it begins." For several long seconds, neither of them moved. Ethan listened carefully, waiting for the familiar chorus of engines, maintenance announcements, and distant conversations that had always surrounded the docking district. Nothing came. The silence felt unnatural precisely because the station had never been quiet before. Even during scheduled maintenance, there was always the low vibration of machinery somewhere beneath the decks. Now the only sound was the faint bubbling of soup inside the small cooking pot. Ethan walked toward the window and pressed one hand lightly against the cool glass. Outside, mechanics stood beside motionless service vehicles, looking around with puzzled expressions. Cargo crews pointed toward dark communication towers that only moments earlier had flashed with synchronized navigation lights. Every illuminated sign across the docking ring had gone black at the same time. Power failure? Ethan wondered aloud. Lysera slowly shook her head. No. How can you be certain? She stared through the window without blinking. Because electricity is not the first thing that disappears. Ethan turned toward her, waiting for the explanation she had avoided since they met. Instead, she quietly folded her hands around the bowl that was already beginning to cool. When I was a child, she said softly, my grandmother used to tell me that every civilization has a heartbeat. You cannot see it, but you always know when it is there. Ships passing overhead, children laughing, doors opening, music from apartments. The tiny sounds that remind people they are not alone. Her voice became even quieter. The heartbeat always fades before anything else. Ethan pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Tell me what you know. Lysera lowered her eyes to the soup. If I tell you everything, you may ask me to leave. You have been expecting that since we met. She nodded once. Everyone eventually does. Ethan reached for his own bowl, but did not begin eating. Then perhaps everyone else made their decision too quickly. She looked up at him with visible surprise. You are still listening. Listening is usually cheaper than making assumptions. A faint breath escaped her that almost sounded like a laugh. It disappeared as quickly as it came, but Ethan noticed it anyway. Outside, several maintenance drones suddenly drifted downward before settling gently onto the landing platform as if they had simply fallen asleep. No sparks. No alarms. They had merely stopped. Ethan frowned. That is new. Yes, Lysra whispered. It is getting closer. Before he could ask what she meant, his communication tablet vibrated against the table. The display flickered weakly before stabilizing long enough to show a message from the station operations network. System interruption. Remain calm. Essential services temporarily unavailable. Seconds later, the screen faded into darkness. Ethan tapped the controls twice. Nothing happened. He reached for a portable radio sitting on the shelf behind him. Static answered every frequency. Even the emergency channels remained silent. He set the device back down slowly. Now I am beginning to understand why people were frightened. Lysra closed her eyes for a moment. They were frightened because they believed I caused this. Did you? The question lingered between them without accusation. Ethan simply wanted the truth. Lysra answered with painful honesty. Every place I have been eventually becomes like this. She paused before adding the words she seemed to fear the most. But I have never believed that I was the reason. Ethan studied her expression carefully. There was no deception hidden there. Only exhaustion carried by someone who had spent years accepting blame she could never explain. He leaned back in his chair and quietly folded his arms. Those are two very different statements. Lysra looked at him with cautious hope. You noticed? Ethan nodded once. You said it follows you. You never said you create it. For the first time since entering his ship, the guarded distance in her silver eyes softened. Outside the darkened window, the station remained unnaturally still, while somewhere far beyond the silent skyline, something deep beneath the city released another low mechanical tone that seemed older than the buildings themselves. The second mechanical tone lingered in the air several seconds longer than the first. It did not sound like an alarm or an engine. It resembled something vast taking a slow breath beneath the foundations of the city. Ethan stood and quietly crossed to the cockpit, where rows of instrument panels lined the narrow control station. He pressed the primary power switch. Nothing happened. He tried the emergency battery. A single amber light blinked once before fading into darkness. His transport had survived electrical storms, asteroid debris, and radiation bursts that would have disabled newer ships. Yet now every system had become perfectly still. No sparks. No warning lights. No error messages. Only silence. That should not be possible, he murmured. Lysra remained seated at the small table, her fingers wrapped around the cooling bowl as though its remaining warmth anchored her to the present. It always begins with machines, she said. Then communication. Then people stop believing what they know. Ethan returned from the cockpit carrying a compact diagnostic scanner. The handheld device refused to activate. He turned it over once before placing it gently on the counter beside several other lifeless tools. I have spent 15 years repairing broken equipment, he said. Broken things usually tell you why they stopped working. Lysra lowered her gaze. This one never does. Rain continued drifting across the window, but even the steady tapping against the hull seemed strangely muted. Ethan noticed another detail that unsettled him more than the powerless electronics. The station clocks outside had frozen at exactly the same time. Every digital display visible through the window showed 8:43 in bright, unmoving numbers. Time itself had not stopped, yet every machine responsible for measuring it had. Ethan slowly sat back down across from Lysra. You said you never believed you caused this. She nodded. Because I remember when it first found me. Her words hung quietly between them. Ethan did not interrupt. I was 12, she continued. My family lived on a research colony beyond the Perseus corridor. Scientists came because they detected something ancient beneath the planet's crust. They believed it was abandoned technology left by a civilization older than recorded history. She paused, her silver eyes fixed somewhere beyond the cabin walls. One day they opened a chamber that should never have been disturbed. Ethan listened without speaking. Nobody understood what escaped, Lysra whispered. It had no body, no language, no face. It moved through signals, memory, and sound. Wherever it awakened, machines slowly became quiet. Then entire cities forgot how to function. The researchers discovered one terrible truth before everything collapsed. She looked directly at Ethan. It was not following the colony. Her voice trembled for the first time. It was following me. Ethan folded his hands together, considering every word with the calm patience that had carried him through countless difficult repairs. Why you? Nobody knows. They never found an explanation? Only theories. She drew a slow breath. Some believed I accidentally interrupted its path. Others believed it mistook me for something that no longer exists. Eventually, the theories stopped matching. Every government reached the same conclusion. Ethan already knew the answer before she spoke it. They blamed you. Lysra nodded. It was easier to exile one frightened girl than admit nobody understood what hunted her. Silence settled over the cabin once again, but this silence felt different. It no longer belonged to fear alone. It belonged to understanding. Ethan reached across the table and quietly slid the untouched basket of warm bread closer to her. Eat while it is still warm, he said gently. Lysra blinked in surprise. Did you hear anything I just told you? Every word. And you are not asking me to leave? Ethan offered a tired smile. No, because if what you said is true, sending you away would only leave you facing it alone. That does not solve anything. For the first time in many years, Lysra felt something she barely recognized. It was not safety. The danger outside had only grown. It was something far rarer. Someone had finally believed the difference between being followed by darkness and becoming darkness itself. The warmth inside the cabin no longer reached the windows. Frost slowly traced delicate white patterns across the edges of the glass, despite the climate controls still holding their last stored temperature. Ethan noticed it immediately. His ship had remained docked inside a fully enclosed station for almost 3 years, and frost had never formed on the interior side of the windows before. Outside, the docking platform looked frozen in a moment that refused to move forward. Workers still stood where they had been minutes earlier. Pilots remained beside their silent ships. Nobody panicked. Nobody shouted. They simply watched the growing silence with uncertain expressions, as though waiting for someone else to explain what reality itself no longer could. Then another sound appeared. Footsteps. Not hurried. Measured. Deliberate. Ethan looked through the forward viewport and saw 6 figures walking across the docking platform, wearing long charcoal coats marked with the silver emblem of the Carthos Civic Authority. Behind them followed 2 station security officers carrying inactive communication tablets that had become little more than pieces of dark glass. Their eyes searched every docking bay until they settled on Ethan's transport. Lysra closed her eyes before they even reached the hatch. They found me faster than I expected. Ethan quietly stood. How did they know? Someone always tells them. 3 firm knocks echoed against the outer hatch. Not aggressive. Official. Ethan stepped toward the entrance and pressed the manual release since the electronic controls remained unresponsive. The door opened with a slow mechanical groan. A middle-aged woman with silver streaks in her dark hair stood waiting beneath the station lights. Her uniform remained perfectly pressed despite the rain, and years of responsibility showed in the lines around her calm gray eyes. She studied Ethan first before allowing her gaze to move past him toward Lysra. Mr. Carter, she said politely. My name is Director Helena Brooks of Civic Emergency Management. Ethan nodded once. What can I do for you? Helena took a careful breath before answering. We have reason to believe you recently acquired an individual known as Lysra. Ethan noticed her choice of words. Acquired. Not rescued. Not met. She is here, he answered honestly. We need to take her into protective custody immediately. Lysra quietly lowered her head. Ethan looked from Helena back toward the silent station outside. Protective custody for whom? Helena hesitated. For everyone. Ethan folded his arms. Has she committed a crime? No. Has anyone proven she caused what is happening? Helena remained silent. Then what exactly are you protecting people from? One of the security officers shifted uneasily before speaking. Sir, every historical record connected to her presence ends the same way. Ethan met the officer's eyes. Historical records are not evidence. They are patterns. Helena's composed expression softened slightly. Mr. Carter, I understand why you are asking these questions. I would ask them too. But the city is shutting down. Transportation has stopped. Communications are gone. Hospitals are operating on emergency backup systems that are beginning to fail. People are frightened. Ethan answered without raising his voice. Fear does not make assumptions become facts. The words settled over the group more heavily than the silence surrounding the station. Helena glanced toward Lysra, who had not spoken a single word since the officials arrived. Is that why you never ran? Helena asked quietly. Lysra finally looked up. After enough years, you stop believing there is anywhere left to run. Even the security officers lowered their eyes for a moment. Ethan noticed something important. Nobody standing outside the ship looked at Lysra with hatred. Only exhaustion. They had inherited a story repeated so many times that it no longer required proof. Helena slowly removed a folded paper document from her coat pocket and offered it to Ethan. The city council has authorized voluntary transfer before mandatory quarantine begins. I came personally because I hoped we could avoid treating anyone without dignity. Ethan accepted the paper but did not sign it. He simply folded it once and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Then he stepped slightly to one side, placing himself naturally between Lysra and the open hatch. His movement was calm, almost ordinary, yet everyone outside understood what it meant. For the first time that evening, someone had chosen not to stand against the silence, but beside the person everyone else believed it belonged to. No one spoke after Ethan stepped in front of Lysra. The quiet seemed to settle over every face gathered outside the transport, making even the soft rain sound distant. Director Helena Brooks held Ethan's gaze for several long seconds before lowering her voice. You believe I came here to arrest her? Ethan answered honestly. I believe you came because you think taking her away will save the city. Helena nodded once. Yes. And if it does not? She had no answer. The silence between them became more revealing than any speech. Then the station lights flickered once. Not because power returned, but because something deeper beneath the city awakened. Every dark display across the docking bay briefly glowed with a single pale white symbol that none of them recognized. It remained visible for less than a heartbeat before disappearing again. The frozen clocks still displayed the same unmoving time. A maintenance drone resting on the platform suddenly rotated its camera toward the eastern skyline without receiving any command. Then another drone did the same. Then another. Within seconds, hundreds of inactive machines across the station faced exactly the same direction, as though listening to a voice nobody else could hear. One security officer slowly removed his helmet. That has never happened before. Lysra stared toward the horizon with growing dread. It found us. Ethan turned to her. What exactly found us? She closed her eyes. The researchers gave it many names. None of them were correct. It does not hunt because it hates. It searches because it remembers. Helena frowned. Remembers what? Lysra looked toward the endless rows of silent machines. Someone it lost. Confusion spread across every face. Ethan remained still. You think it mistakes you for someone else? I do not know. Her voice trembled. When they opened that chamber years ago, it looked at me. Not with eyes. With recognition. Since then it has never stopped following. Helena slowly shook her head. That cannot be possible. Neither can an entire city becoming silent without a single damaged wire. Ethan replied quietly. Before anyone answered, another sound drifted through the station. It was not mechanical this time. It resembled distant singing carried by the wind, impossibly soft and impossibly old. Nobody understood the words, yet every person present instinctively looked upward. The rain itself seemed to pause in the air for a fraction of a second before continuing its gentle descent. Lysra's breathing became uneven. It is closer than it has ever been. Ethan noticed something else. She was no longer afraid for herself. She was watching everyone around her with quiet sorrow, as though already mourning people who were still alive. Tell me the truth, he said gently. If you leave with them, will this stop? Lysra answered immediately. No. Helena looked sharply toward her. You are certain? It has followed me across 6 worlds. Every government believed distance would save them. None of them understood that I was never the destination. Ethan took one slow breath. The pieces finally fit together. You are not the curse, he said. You are the marker. Lysra looked at him in stunned silence. No one had ever described it that way. Every official report had called her contaminated, dangerous, cursed, or anomalous. Never a marker. Ethan continued, his voice calm despite the impossible circumstances surrounding them. People kept moving you from place to place because they believed they were escaping the problem. Instead, they kept bringing the problem to new cities. Helena's expression slowly changed as years of accepted assumptions unraveled before her. The fear that had guided every decision suddenly collided with a possibility nobody had been willing to consider. Lysera lowered her head as tears quietly gathered in her silver eyes. I spent 15 years believing everyone was right. Ethan looked at her with the same steady kindness that had led him to stop at the marketplace hours earlier. Then perhaps the first mistake was never yours. Perhaps it belonged to every person who saw someone being followed by darkness and decided the easiest answer was to blame the one who kept running instead of asking what was chasing her. The ancient singing drifted across the silent station one final time before fading into the endless rain. Then, almost as quietly as it had begun, the strange mechanical tone beneath the city disappeared. No explosion followed. No blinding light filled the sky. There was only stillness. Ethan remained standing beside Lysera at the open hatch while every person on the docking platform waited for something terrible that never arrived. A single maintenance drone suddenly lifted itself from the ground with its familiar electronic hum. Moments later, another awakened. Then another. One by one, navigation beacons blinked back to life across the station. The frozen clocks flickered uncertainly before advancing together to the correct time. Somewhere beyond the docking ring, a child laughed. It was a small sound, almost lost beneath the rain, but everyone heard it. The station announcement system crackled with static before a calm, automated voice returned as though waking from a long sleep. Docking operations have resumed. Please report any technical irregularities to station personnel. We appreciate your patience. The ordinary words felt extraordinary after so much silence. Mechanics exchanged confused smiles. Pilots hurried back toward their ships. Cargo vehicles rolled forward once again. Life did not return all at once. It returned one heartbeat at a time. Director Helena Brooks slowly removed her gloves and looked toward Lysera with an expression completely different from the one she had carried onto the platform. It stopped, she whispered. Lysera looked equally confused. It has never stopped before. Ethan quietly glanced toward the distant skyline where the rain clouds had begun to separate, allowing narrow bands of evening sunlight to spill across the towers of Carthos. Maybe it was never searching for another place, he said softly. Maybe it was searching for someone willing to stop running. Lysera stared at him in silence. For 15 years, every city had hidden her, imprisoned her, transported her, or abandoned her. Nobody had ever remained beside her once the silence arrived. Ethan had, whether by courage, stubbornness, or simple human kindness. He had refused to treat fear as proof. Helena slowly stepped forward until she stood only a few feet from Lysera. I owe you an apology, she said. Not because I was afraid. Fear is human. Because I allowed fear to replace compassion. Lysera lowered her eyes. You are the first person to apologize. Helena offered a gentle smile. Then we have both waited too long. Several days later, the official investigation reached a conclusion that satisfied almost no one. Engineers found no damaged systems. Scientists discovered no measurable anomaly. Historians quietly reopened forgotten archives from the abandoned colony beyond the Perseus corridor. For the first time, the reports no longer described Lysera as the source of unexplained events. They described her as a survivor of them. The warning signs disappeared from public records. The marketplace removed the empty auction platform. Ethan finally repaired his transport ship using help freely offered by mechanics who had once laughed at him for spending his last 600 credits. None of them mentioned the money again. On a cool autumn evening, Lysera stood beside Ethan on the station observation deck overlooking thousands of departing ships crossing the stars. Travelers passed them without whispering. Children pointed excitedly toward the traffic lanes instead of staring at her blue skin. For the first time in many years, she walked through a crowd without anyone stepping aside in fear. Do you think they will remember? She asked quietly. Ethan watched the lights disappearing into the night before answering. Maybe not every detail. He smiled gently. But they will remember that one day an entire city became silent, and the loudest truth anyone heard came from the man who asked a simple question before passing judgment. Lysera looked toward the endless stars, and for the first time since childhood, they no longer felt like places she needed to escape to. They simply looked like home. Sometimes the greatest miracle is not that darkness leaves. It is that someone chooses to stay until the light finds its way back.